DevOps Infrastructure with Abel Wang.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host. Make sure to check out www.azuredevops.show for past episodes and show notes. And I am really excited. We have a fantastic guest on the show today. Abel Wang is a principal cloud advocate specializing in DevOps and Azure with a background in application development. And he's currently part of Donovan Brown's League of Extraordinary Cloud DevOps Advocates. But before joining Microsoft, Abel spent 7 years as a process consultant and a certified Scrum Master, helping customers globally develop solutions using agile practices and Team Foundation Server. And prior to that, he founded and sold his own software company. But with not working, Abel's either writing code, and yes, that's what he does for fun, or playing one of his mini guitars, or training for the Great Wall Marathon. And recently diagnosed with cancer, Abel spits in the face of cancer and will never, ever, ever quit. Abel, welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Just got to confirm, the Great Wall of China Marathon, is that what that is?
That is. So that's training. So I was planning on running the Great Wall of China before I got diagnosed with cancer, right? And so that then being diagnosed with cancer and going through that treatment, that kind of sucked and it put a damper on the training. But I'm finally done with all of that. I'm cancer-free. So I am slowly ramping up my training, trying to get back up there, except my old body is just not responding the way it used to when I was younger. And I'm like, wow, it's taking me much longer to get back into anywhere near marathon shape. So the goal is to run the Great Wall of Marathon. I don't know when that's going to happen, 2021 maybe. Hopefully by 2021 I can ramp up enough.
Okay, so you're just working up the number of miles.
Yeah, I finally got up to 6, which is funny, right? Because I used to run 6 miles like daily without even a thought. And now 6 miles is like where I would run like 18 before, where it's like by the end of 6, I am dying. My legs are dying. Everything is dying. It was pretty funny. I ran 6 yesterday, right? And it was like the most monumental achievement I've done in a while.
Well, that's awesome. Well, man, congratulations on that. And I think everyone now has several friends who've gone through cancer, some for the better, some for congratulations. That's a huge, huge event. Just say, I'm cancer free. It's amazing.
Thank you so much. It was a rough year, but 2020 is going to be awesome. I'm so ready for 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know that a lot of listeners have probably either seen you speak at a conference or seen you online. But for those who might not be familiar with you, what's your background and how did you end up doing what you do now at Microsoft?
I write code. That's pretty much what I do, right? So I always joke and say I'm that dude that, eat, drinks, and live writing code, because that's pretty much has defined who and what I am for like the past 20 odd years, right? I'd never wanted to write code. My mom was a computer science professor, and I was just like, I don't want to do that. I want to be a rock star, right? And so I tried that, and I failed miserably. So then I was like, I kind of need to make money somehow, and maybe this computer science thing will work out. And so I went back to school. And that's when I realized I really love writing code. Like everything about it makes sense for me, right? You have all of these confines of, these are the specs, and this is the machine that it needs to run on. This is how much memory. And I'm so old that back in our day, we had to really worry about memory, right?
Yeah.
And so many different constraints. But within those constraints, that's kind of your domain, right? That's kind of like I can do whatever I wanted within those constraints. And so to me, that type of creativity where I'm bound by massive amounts of constraints, but inside I can have all the creativity in the world, that really makes me happy, right? So I love writing code, and I got super lucky too, because when I was going up, I was right around the .com era, right? So because of that, I jumped on the .com bandwagon, started up my own software company, and right, we created something, we sold it, and I was like, yay, I'm a billionaire, I never have to work again. Then I got the check, and I went, I'm not a billionaire, I'm not a millionaire, I'm nothing. Oh, I can't retire forever. Damn it. New plan, right? But I had the luxury of not needing to get a job immediately, right? So I can kind of pick and choose what I wanted to, which was kind of cool. So what made me really curious was, how come some companies succeed, but most projects just fail miserably? And I'm thinking about all the projects that I've been on, right? And most of them have failed miserably. They've gone over time, over budget, massive amount of bugs, et cetera, right? So my first thought was, the developers I was with, they must have sucked, because clearly I'm awesome. But then I thought about that and went, no, well, not really, because the dev world is pretty small, especially in Houston, Texas, where I was that entire time. So it's like, from group to group to group, I would jump from company to company and all that stuff. But it was the core group of devs, you run into the same people all over the place. So I'm like, okay, it's probably not the devs, and what is it? And my conclusion was, it's process, right? It's how we write the software. And that's when I started really going down into that whole agile rabbit hole. And it made so much sense to me to build software in an agile manner. And back then, agile was a thing, but it was barely a thing. And so it was a lot of figuring out the right way to do agile, the best way to do agile. And then I joined a consulting firm, actually with Donovan, where we would fly everywhere, get embedded into dev teams in these massive companies, and help them make that transformation from very waterfall into a very agile base. Along the way, it was kind of interesting too, because at first we couldn't even build the right software on time, right? Like sprint after sprint was just failure. But we got to the point where we could be successful sprint after sprint. But it would take us like a week and a half to deploy into production, and we'd have 2-week sprints. So quickly, like within 2 sprints, we're like so far behind, right? And we're like, okay, how do we deploy? How do we get this into production fast enough? And that's when we started looking at, oh, maybe we need to automate. And then, the whole DevOps buzz started happening. And I was like, oh, this is a perfect extension of how do we write software correctly? I mean, this isn't the writing part now, but I think Donovan said it best. It's all about continuously delivering value to our end users, right? So that's what it's about. You got to be able to do agile correctly first, but after that, well, we need to be able to deploy fast enough, right? So I started looking at the whole DevOps. I started dropping into the whole DevOps world. And then it was just a natural progression, right? Okay, great. Now we've automated everything. We can get our code into production fast enough. Wow, we're just shipping bugs really, really quickly. Like nobody has time to do end-to-end functional testing. So how do we do that? So then I started looking at, okay, how do we maintain quality? Same thing with databases and security now and AI ML, right? Just like the latest and greatest. Everything is, okay, what hurts the most next? And then we find that one thing and we keep on going. So that's kind of how I ended up in the DevOps space. But to me, it's still about continuously delivering value. And I think it still starts with doing agile correctly. So I'm still an agilist.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. And a lot of people use the sprint constructs from Scrum, and it won't make you go fast, but it'll force you to recognize how slow you're going, and so you can confront those things. Like most of the sprints going to deploying.
Yes.
How can we not spend most of the sprint in deployment activities?
Yes. It's figuring all of that stuff out. I'm a huge fan of agile. It just makes sense. And again, it's kind of like, when people talk about people that don't understand agile, they're like, oh, it's just, utter chaos. And I'm like, well, no, actually agile has very tight constraints on how you need to run your project. It's not just the Wild West, right? There are very, very solid rules on this is what you must do from one sprint to the next. And if you follow them, good things happen. So again, huge agilist. Yeah,
absolutely. I run into a lot of people, I'm not sure if you do, who talk about agile, but they haven't stumbled onto agilemanifesto.org, or they haven't read, some of Ken Schwaber's original writings on Scrum.
Right.
The thinking for why do we want to do this? And so I think anyone using those probably needs to read some of the original documents and books.
They really need to. The why is incredibly important, right? Because otherwise it's just kind of like, okay, we go through all of these ceremonies and why are we doing this? This is stupid. I mean, my thought is it's stupid until I understand the whys, and then it starts making a lot more sense. Although, interesting enough, I was talking to my daughter. So my daughter graduated from UT about 2 years ago in computer science, and she's like working professionally writing code now.
In Austin, that UT.
Yeah, that UT.
Oh, right down the road.
Yes.
Fantastic. Congratulations.
So I graduated and immediately got like a full-time job in the industry, which was awesome. Surprisingly enough, she ended up in Seattle as well. We totally didn't plan it. So we all live in the same city, which is awesome. Yeah. But, when I was telling her about this agile thing, she kind of looked at me weirdly like, what? Yeah, that's how you build software, Dad. Like, what are you talking about? And I was trying to explain to her, no, the way we used to build software, and I couldn't even begin to, I didn't even finish explaining how we did things in the waterfall world that so many of us grew up in. She just looked at me like, that is the weirdest and dumbest way to build software.
Right.
I'm like, well, yeah, for you, but for us, we didn't know any better. We didn't know how else to build software. So it's kind of funny because it seems like the kids that are growing up, they just grow into this, right? This is just what they do.
Well, I think the physical world kind of forces us down a path because in the waterfall days, just the discussion of provisioning a server was a big business event. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I think that cascaded down into the rest of the thinking too.
Oh yeah, totally. That's funny too, because you say provisioning a server. Back in those days, if you talked about provisioning a server, my eyes would glaze over. I'd be like, yeah, I don't care about that at all. And right now, when you just said provisioning a server, I immediately started thinking of like ARM templates and Terraform and all the stuff that I do now to provision a server. And I'm like, oh, wow. Talk about a drastic shift from, I guess, the early 90s all the way to like, the 2000s right. Compared to now. That just a dev's thinking has changed dramatically.
The business budgeting event to how much money you're going to spend to buy it. Then you put in the order. Then something comes in. Then someone with a screwdriver screws it into the cabinet.
And all those things have nothing to do with me as a dev, right?
Right.
And now it's just like, I check in an ARM template, goes through the pipeline, and look, I just provision all the infrastructure I need automatically. So cool.
Absolutely. So fast forward and you work with Donovan as a consultant in those companies, and now you're working at Microsoft, creating patterns and kind of leading huge swaths of the industry instead of one client at a time. I'm sure there's plenty of listeners not familiar with the work of TheLoECDA. Tell us about that.
So it's kind of funny, right? 2 years ago, Donovan formed a group of cloud advocates that specialized in DevOps. And as a joke, someone said we should name ourselves the League of Extraordinary Cloud DevOps Advocates. And it was hilarious, right? It's one of those, texts, those instant message streams. And then somebody tweeted it, and it's like, well, now it's a thing, right? So from a private joke to a thing. But what's kind of cool about it is it's easily recognizable. The name is hilarious, but it's easily recognizable, and people use it to ask for help, right? So our charter is literally to help everybody get into Azure using DevOps best practices. And notice I did not say using Microsoft tools to get into Azure, right? We're not saying you have to use Azure DevOps Services or use GitHub Actions or whatever. Use whatever tools you want. Azure is an open system. You want to use Jenkins and Spinnaker, have that. Whatever tool sets that you want to use. Our charter is to help everybody get into Azure using DevOps best practices. Right? So if people need to get a hold of us to ask questions, the easiest way is to tweet at us, hashtag it, LOECDA. That literally lights up a team room for us. We see it, and we can either answer your questions, or if I don't know, I'll find the people at Microsoft that can. So it went from a joke to it's actually a useful tool for people to get a hold of us now.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
Some quick announcements before we get back to the show. For anyone using Azure DevOps Services, Octopus Deploy, or Redgate SQL Change Automation, or any mix of .NET DevOps tools and platforms, I'm offering free inspections. In my work at ClearMeasure, I have a 30-point DevOps inspection that looks at 30 distinct points across the 7 key areas of a DevOps environment. So just go ahead and email me at jeffrey@clear-measure.com. That's JEFFREY. If you'd like to take advantage of that and like me to take a look at your DevOps environment. You know, I've seen the hashtag working, and of course anybody can search, and the response time is, not in the middle of the night, but the response time is pretty quick.
My running joke is if you tweet at me and I don't answer, maybe you should call my wife, because clearly something happened to me.
Right. So any listeners on the show, that's your lifeline. That's awesome. That's awesome. Yep. And you mentioned using Azure. We don't care what tools. Just an observation. I want to get your take on it. It used to be that Microsoft said, "Hey, we want everything to run on Windows," and of course on the server side, we want all your stuff to run on Windows Server and Windows with everything. It seems like the operating system has moved from a server operating system now to the data center or cloud operating system. So Microsoft kind of has the same message of, hey, we want all your stuff to run on our operating system, but the level of the operating system is just much higher.
That is pretty true. Like I tell people, I don't care what operating system you use. I don't care what language you use. I don't care what tool sets you use. I just want all of your for loops. I want to run them all, right? And so you're very correct in the sense that, yeah, we want your everything. You can do it however you want. I just want it running in Azure. That's the big thing.
Awesome. So what are the new advances that people should be paying attention to? There's been, since continuous integration came around, the Addison Wesley book in 2006, and people have been talking about automated builds, and now people are saying, I can deploy automatically, and infrastructure as code's a buzzword. What's the landscape? What are the things that people should absolutely be doing because it's a solved problem versus the things that are still being worked on that maybe 5 years from now will be the solved problem?
You mentioned infrastructure as code. I'm a huge fan of infrastructure as code, and I think we don't use it even nearly enough. There are so many workloads that we don't use it for, and still, of course, there are so many that we do. Infrastructure as code is massive. It's absolutely amazing. The other things that are...
Can you define that? Is there somebody out there who has no idea what we're talking about?
Oh, sure. So I can define the infrastructure that my application runs on, like the servers that I need to run on, how much memory it holds, the type of databases it needs, things like that, right? Just the physical infrastructure that it needs to run on. I never used to care about that because I'm a dev, right? But then it took me a while to realize that my application is so much more than just my beautiful code. Well, I think it's beautiful. My code is so much more than my code. It's really my code and the infrastructure that it runs on. Those two things help determine how my app is going to behave. So now we have the ability to define what our infrastructure will look like in a series of code files, right? They can be scripts, using something like the Azure CLI to provision whatever you need. They can be ARM templates, which describe exactly what your infrastructure is going to look like. You can use third-party systems like Terraform, which again, they have a special scripting language of theirs, which now you can describe exactly the type of servers that you want, the type of app services, maybe a Kubernetes cluster, et cetera, right? So in code, you can describe exactly what the infrastructure that you want, and then you can check that into source control. And then come build and deploy time, we can grab that code file that describes your infrastructure and on the fly provision everything that you need, right? And so you can do this for both cloud and also with your on-prem resources as well. Of course, with cloud, it's just so much easier to do this. But the really awesome thing about this, why do I love this so much? It's because now in my source control system, I have my source code. I have maybe my database schema. I have now my infrastructure as well, right? So when somebody forks my repo, they get everything at that point in time, right? Everything is versioned together. And that right there is super, super powerful. Right? So I can go back, I can go back 5 years, assuming my project goes back 5 years. I can go back 5 years in time, grab that space in time, and I'll have my source code, my database schema, my build and release pipeline, and also the infrastructure that my application runs on. And again, this is important because my app is so much more than my code. It is my code plus my infrastructure that it runs on. So having the ability to check my infrastructure into source control, or what my infrastructure needs to be in source control, and then having the ability to deploy that infrastructure on the fly, super, super powerful and super useful.
Yeah, it seems like a paradigm shift has happened where if you're on VMs or full operating systems, somebody else says, this is the server capacity and the shape of it. This is what we have available. Make sure your application fits in there, versus the application developers essentially designing the shape of the server capacity.
Yeah. And granted, I'm still not an expert at infrastructure and operations at all, right? So I'm going to lean extremely heavily on the people on my team that are good at operations, right? So on my team, if I need to stand up a Kubernetes cluster, I'm going to ping Jessica and be like, help me out, right? Or anything other ops related, I'm going to ping Steven. So we still have our areas of specialty. Like really, if we're going to talk VMs or a cluster or whatever, I don't really know what size I need and blah. Once you go into the detail, I know from a pretty surface level, but once you start diving into the details, I'm just like, I have no idea what means what, or how does that affect my app, right? But that's why we have teammates, right? That's why we've broken down all these walls so we can communicate freely.
It creates so many new scenario possibilities. I mean, just deploying, some people might say, oh, well, why would I go through all that effort? All I'm doing is copying files to an IIS server. Why do I need to do all this? But for people who need to do some type of performance or even medium scale performance testing, having the ability to test infrastructure configurations that modify the performance characteristics, it's not even feasible. It's just so expensive to do it without scripting your environments.
Yes, and this, you can scale it up or scale it down however you need. And I think a great example of that is, let's say we have a weird intermittent bug, right? A lot of times these bugs are caused by the hardware that it runs on, the infrastructure that it runs on, or the configuration of that infrastructure. And now, if it changes, we're tracking those changes to the infrastructure so we can go back and actually debug the correct infrastructure and figure out exactly what's going on. And this isn't like brand new, right? We've had infrastructure as code for many, many years, and people are. I'm finally seeing it kind of turn the corner where people are really embracing it and people are really using it. But I just wanted to give it a shout out because I think it's so important. I think a lot more needs to go into AI ML in terms of AI ML DevOps as well. And we've had some improvements and we've had some tooling improvements with more to come. So that's going to be an exciting space to look at as well. So AI ML is being embedded into almost everything we do now. And it's really exciting, right? Because since I can remember, right, even in the early 80s, we've been talking about AI ML, and it's like, I don't think the theory, and I'm not an AI ML person, so I could be totally wrong, but I don't think the theory of what they're doing has changed a whole lot since back then. But I think our compute has finally caught up to like where we can actually do what we were talking about in the 80s.
Good point.
It's super exciting for me to see, and it's just getting easier to use, and it's being embedded everywhere. But the whole DevOps cycle of doing ML stuff is still a little bit messy, but it's getting better, right? So that's going to come in sharper focus, I think, in 2020 as well. And I think the final exciting thing that I would tell people to look at is there's a lot of very exciting stuff happening in GitHub, right? So GitHub, they released Actions 2.0 recently, which is their built-in workflow system, an automated workflow system where you can create automations for all sorts of stuff. So of course, I'm a CI/CD guy, right? I'm a DevOps guy. So I was like, I'm going to build pipelines using it. And it is surprisingly easy to use and really, really pleasant to use, right? So I use Azure DevOps Services for everything because that's work at Microsoft, right? And when I looked at actions at GitHub, I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. It's a YAML-based build system or build and release system. It's more than that, right? It's a workflow system. But for me, I was looking at CI/CD. I was like, okay, build and release system. YAML's YAML. Good, bad, whatever. There's pros and cons to it. But I started playing with it, and I figured out the schema pretty quickly. What really made me happy, though, is when I started playing with writing custom actions, right? So in Azure DevOps, we can write custom tasks, do exactly what we want or something specific. In actions, you write something called a custom action. And at the end of the day, they're not that different, right? It's like JavaScript. I'm like, okay, I can write JavaScript, which means I can write, well, anything I can do from the command line, I can easily get the action to do. But to write an action, the physical act of writing the action and testing the action and using the action was so simple, right? I didn't have to package it as a V6, upload it to a marketplace, do that. You just point it to your repo and it just magically works, right? So I'm like, that is really neat. So the built-in CI/CD system actions, I think today, which is January 21st, it works great for CI. I think for CD, it might be missing some features that really resonate for like enterprise crowds and things like that. Like things like approvals from one environment to the next, just some more advanced type features. But those are coming really soon, right? And so much is going to be coming into GitHub. I'm really excited to see what they do with that platform.
Is integration between GitHub and Azure DevOps, or are they going to be kind of kept separate?
They're going to be kept separate, but clearly there's going to be a convergent, right? So what I always tell people is these are just facts that everybody knows. Microsoft spent $9 gajillion buying GitHub. I don't know the number, but it's some big number.
Yeah.
At
it's
GitHub,
40 something.
It's some big number. There are 40 million developers on GitHub. And a lot of these developers have nothing to do with Microsoft and want nothing to do with Microsoft. Right? They're developers. So that between those two things is kind of like, okay, we cannot mess this up because we spent an awful lot of money buying GitHub. So we can't mess up GitHub. But we also kind of can't mess up the value for GitHub for Microsoft because we also spent a lot of money for that, right? So to me, I got to speak for myself. I can't speak for Microsoft. It makes perfect sense if Azure DevOps Services and GitHub kind of converge, right? Because it doesn't make sense to have two tools that do the same type of stuff. From my point of view, GitHub is really shiny and really cool, and it's the most awesome, neat new toy with 40 freaking million developers, right? So I would not be surprised if GitHub got an awful lot of love and all the amazing features inside of Azure DevOps Services got moved into GitHub, right? I also know for a fact that Azure DevOps Services is not going anywhere for a couple of reasons. Number one, all of our stuff at Microsoft is held inside of Azure DevOps Services, all our source code for Windows, SharePoint, Office, et cetera, right? And for a lot of technical reasons, it would be impossible for us to move that into GitHub, right? So just for our own stuff, our own tool chain, we need to have Azure DevOps Services around. We also need to have a DevOps tool chain that will work for people that are not in GitHub. Right. So there are a lot of people, they use things like GitLab, or maybe they use wherever they're storing their source code. They might need a tool chain that will help them get into Azure really, really easily. So we're still going to need Azure DevOps Services, DevOps Services built into Azure that will help people get their code into running in Azure really quickly and easily. But all the new, shiny, coolest, latest, and greatest, yeah, man, keep your eyes on GitHub. It's going to be really, really cool really soon. Awesome.
Now, you don't work on the R&D teams of either of those products, but we talked about infrastructure as code, where from some files, whatever format happens to be, in source control, you just execute those and boom, the environments are up and running. Mm-hmm. Now, there seems to be a glaring hole in that story, and I'm sure that you're addressing it, but that is the DevOps environment itself. And if we lose it or it goes away or our app goes dormant and something, and then all you have is the version control repository, you still have to manually put all those things back together. What's the future of that, of being able to maybe from a template or just literally have the entire chain all the way through to Azure with the press of a button?
So we almost have that, right? Within our CI/CD systems, we can describe our CI/CD system using YAML. So the YAML pipelines. So if I can describe my CI/CD pipelines using YAML, I can check that YAML file in, which again means that everything is now versioned together, right? My source code, my database, my infrastructure, and now also my CI/CD pipelines. So I could easily go from nothing at all, right? An empty GitHub repository. I can fork somebody's repository, and now I have their everything, including their CI/CD pipelines, which means I can just click run, and it will build my application and then deploy it, into provision whatever I need in Azure, and then deploy it for me, right? So one of my favorite demos that I showed, which I'm going to show later this afternoon, is exactly that, right? I call it real world DevOps, where I start with a completely empty Azure subscription because some idiot deleted it, right? Like I went in there and I accidentally deleted my stuff, right before the talk. And then instead of an oh shit moment, it's kind of like, not a big deal. I use DevOps best practices. Let me just kick off my release or kick off my build. And all I have is my source. All I have is a Git repo. Let me just go ahead and kick off this build and grabs the latest code from source control, including my YAML files, including my infrastructure as code, including everything, builds, then it goes ahead, provisions everything in Azure, deploys everything for me, right? So by the end of my talk, all of a sudden you have this microservice space application that's been totally deployed into Azure with Kubernetes clusters, app services, database, Cosmos DB, blah, blah, blah. Just like as many stuff as I can think of to throw into like one application that I possibly can. So we can kind of do that now.
Okay. Where can, I know we're kind of closing up now at our time, but if for people who want to dive in and maybe do exactly what you just said or otherwise, what resources would you point them at?
I would go to abelsquidhead.com. I have the top blog series that I have right now, the latest blog series that I have right now, takes that talk that I did and breaks it down step by step exactly what I do. And from there, you can find links to my Git repos. You can find links to absolutely everything that I did.
Awesome. All right, we'll include a link to that in the show notes to make sure that people can spell it correctly. That's an awesome website. And I really appreciate the time this morning, Abel, for coming on the show and visiting with us. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, man. It was fun talking to you.
Right on. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.